This is the beginning of Book 2 of Thucydides' Peloponnesian War. In Book 1, we discussed why the war began, and so this is the formal beginning of the war. So Thucydides starts by talking about, initially how the Greek feelings are about the war, like who they think is going to be the victor. And pretty much across the board, the feeling was pretty good with Sparta. They, for the longest time, had not really been defeated in battle, and they had the hegemony over Greece. They were the dominant power, and so the general feeling was pretty good with Sparta. And also, since they claimed to liberate Greece from the growing Athenian empire, there was that aspect, and that was in the Persian War, that was the stance by both Athens and Sparta, was to liberate Greece from the Persians, where Athens used that as an opportunity to grow their empire. So the war, 6 months after the battle in Pontidia, there is a crisis in Plataea, which is allied to the Athenians. It's sort of on the southern end of Boeotia, which is the region north of Attica. So it's an important buffer for the Athenians to protect them from the Spartan sympathetic city-states in Boeotia. One of those city-states that is allied against the Athenians is Thebes. And so, again, 6 months after the Battle of Pontidia, 300 Thebans are smuggled into the city of Plataea by a minority party who wishes to see the overthrow of the democratic regime and to ally themselves with Sparta. They smuggled these Thebans in, and essentially what the plan was to bring these guys in under the cover of darkness and to act quickly. And they're able to do this with initial success. They sneak in and they are able to take over the Acropolis, the main market center of the city and the political center of the city. And the Plataeans at first are shocked, but they soon realize that the force is actually a pretty small one, and they attack them during the night and force them out of the city. So the Thebans are, they're running through a city that's unfamiliar to them, and the Plataeans are able to use this to their advantage and attack them in the streets for a kind of urban warfare situation. And they're actually the Plataeans are able to trap the Thebans in a temple, and they are held up there. But what the Thebans were supposed to accomplish was to take control of the city, and then the Theban army on the outside of the city would be able to take the city with essentially no resistance and set up a garrison. Well, because this failed, the Theban army has already arrived, and they are able to focus on destroying the crops outside the city. And they're, essentially, from the Theban point of view, they felt that this was a justified move by how they felt that the Plataeans had made a peace treaty with them, which the minority party in Plataea made a peace treaty with them, but the majority Democratic Party did not. So a pretty weak stance for the Thebans to take, but again, at this point, people are just kind of chomping at the bit. They don't need a whole lot to feel like they are justified to take up arms. And so after this, so what the Plataeans end up doing is, to get the army to go away, is they say, we have the remaining men in our city and we will kill them unless y'all leave now. And so the Thebans don't want to lose these good men of theirs, and they end up dispersing back. But the Plataeans end up killing the prisoners anyway, and they send warnings to Athens about this event, and then the Athenians go in and arrest all the Boeotians in Attica, which seems to be a pretty remarkable accomplishment, to be able to take all of one ethnic group and arrest them. But that's what they do in response to this. And so it is interesting, and again, this goes back to what Thucydides lined out in the first book, was that a lot of these conflicts that are actually initiated by a lot of these, I guess they're proxy wars in a way, where there's these city-states that aren't, it's not, for a long time, it's not directly Athens versus Sparta. And in fact, in the Second Peloponnesian War, this formal, the major Peloponnesian War, there hasn't been a direct conflict between Athens and Sparta from a military point of view. Of course, they've been duking it out indirectly through their allies and other city-states. But it is interesting to see these great powers that are forced into war by minor powers, which is, of course, a great parallel to the starting of World War I. But back to Thucydides, immediately after Plataea, Archidamnus, the king of Sparta, initiates the what's called the Archidamian War, which is just titled that because Archidamnus is the king of Sparta during that time. And so he invades Attica. He's able to assemble his army. And one thing about Archidamnus is, remember, he was fairly moderate about the war. He, well, maybe not moderate, but more cautious. And he was the one who said, we pass this on to our kids. This is not going to be a war that is orthodox by any means. And he's actually good friends with Pericles, which becomes significant. But he sends out heralds to assemble the Boeotian army, and the forces are meant to meet, and then they're supposed to go through Attica. But Archidamnus is still hoping that perhaps upon seeing the army so close to Athens, the Athenians would be more open to come to terms. So he sends heralds to Athens, but they're rejected unless the force leaves to begin peace talks. So the Boeotian army joins the Spartans, and they ravage the land around Plataea. However, Pericles, because he does have a history with Archidamnus, sends him a message to spare his estate, while at the same time he tells the Athenians that he will use the crops and the resources from his estate to benefit the state of Athens. And I'm sure just out of respect for Pericles, this is upheld, though perhaps during this time of war, it probably would have been beneficial to the Athenians, or the Spartans, not to do this. And so Thucydides goes into the general feeling of the Athenians at the time. And Pericles is pretty confident in his plan of being able to hold up within the walls of Athens and down his long walls to the port of Piraeus. And he feels that they can outlast the Spartans because of their naval superiority, and being able to bring in finances and resources from around the Aegean, and be able to outlast them financially. And so Thucydides then goes into the military power of the Athenians at the time, which was 13,000 ready hoplites within the city and 1,200 cavalry, plus another 16,000 hoplites on guard throughout the empire. And the navy consisted of 300 triremes. So pretty massive force, but they're still unwilling to engage the Spartans in a open hoplite battle. So again, with Pericles' strategy, before the Spartans are able to get into Attica, he calls all the Athenians in the countryside to come into the city, which triples the population from 100,000 to 300,000 roughly. But this isn't an easy move, and Thucydides talks about the reservation of the people in the country who have had a long history with working the land. You can imagine that there's been, generation to generation handing down. And so there's a sentimental value, but there's also the pride of holding onto their land and not retreating before engaging. And of course, that the Greeks are usually a very proud people, and so to give up their land without fighting is in some ways viewed as shameful. So there's this resentment that builds against Pericles, even though they are outlasting the Spartans at this time. So the Peloponnesians end up meeting in a city that's northwest of Athens, and they try to take it. It's pronunciation is difficult, but it's Ono. At least that's how I've figured out how to pronounce it. But people criticize Archidamnus because this takes a while, this siege of Ono. And if Archidamnus had perhaps been a little bit more aggressive, he may have been able to catch Athenians fleeing into the city and surrounding Athens in a more efficient manner instead of trying to take this city that seems ancillary to their primary goal. His thought behind it was that it could be a great staging point, and it could be a point where they could have a more permanent establishment. But they failed to take it with their siege engines. And this essentially gives the Athenians more time to safely move into the city. So after the Peloponnesian League fails to take the city with their siege engines, they head towards the Thracian plain, which is again, getting closer and closer to Athens, where they are routed by the Athenian cavalry. So even though the Athenians are going into the city, they want to avoid the hoplite battle, but they're more than willing to send out skirmishers and cavalry raids, along with Thessalian cavalry as well. And they go in and attack the bulk of the army and pull back. It's kind of quick in and out, since this is kind of the slow-moving, massive hoplite army that's coming towards them. And they get some success doing this, but they are routed, and they have to hold off some of these attacks. So Archidamnus continues to linger in this region in the hopes that he would be able to force a major battle to end the war quickly. And he tries to do this by tempting the Athenians by ravaging the land around him. And here he makes a more permanent camp right outside the walls. The Athenians hoped they would not advance, but on further encroachment they became afraid, and they even wished to go out and engage. Thucydides talks about the young men who are trying to call to arms, and how can we give up our land and so readily? We need to go out and engage. And if you remember in the first Peloponnesian War, they do go out and fight the Spartans in a hoplite battle, and though it's a very costly battle on both sides, and the Athenians are defeated. This is what Pericles wants to avoid. So Pericles would not hold assembly, but did continue to send out more cavalry engagements. So they're able to hold out, and it is very expensive to keep a long-standing army, and so after a while the Spartan resources run low and the army is forced to disperse. Though they did not capture Athens and they didn't capture Ono, they were able to ravage the land around them, and this will not be the last time we see a Spartan invasion of Attica. So the Athenian countermove is to, at the same time, send 100 ships around the Peloponnese and attack certain cities on the coast and cause a lot of havoc behind the Spartans' main force. The vast majority of these raids are very successful for the Athenians, but one raid of Methone, or Methoe, in Laconia, which is the region that contains Sparta, is one of the few raids that was not successful. Reason being is Brasidas, who is an up-and-coming Spartan commander, is able to gather 100 men and charge head-on into the Athenian raid and scatter the enemy, and he ends up saving the town. So you can probably imagine that the Athenians, with a lot of their initial success, and again, the bulk of the Spartan army and Peloponnesian army is in Attica, so they're able to come around, and it's kind of easy pickings in a lot of ways. And so there's probably not as much organization as there should be to repel an attack of 100 men, but Brasidas is very aggressive, as we'll see later in the war, and he's able to boldly repel an attack. However, again, this is a very successful move by the Athenians, generally speaking. They raise Locris, which is on the coastal portion of Euboea, which is the large island north of Athens, and they were able to keep that region under guard with 30 ships. So Athens at one point, they're having to fight against the Peloponnese. And at the same time, they're also trying to hold their lands and keep them under control. If they have to fight revolts and the Spartans at the same time, that'll be a very difficult thing for them to do. And so, in a way, they have to contain their empire and also fight the Spartans. So we'll see a lot of conflicts where the Athenians are actually having to take their focus away from the Peloponnesian League and focus on securing their own lands, and this is an example of that. So another thing that the Athenians do during this time is to expel the populace on the island of Aegina, which is an island in the Sarconic Gulf, which is in between Athens, Megara, and the eastern side of the Peloponnese, and they blamed them for a major cause of the war, and they expel them again, and the Spartans end up giving them a home in Thyrea on the coast of the Peloponnese that faces the Sarconic Gulf. And so there's a parallel here between the Athenians housing the Helots in Naupactus and the Spartans housing the Aeginians in Thyrea. One thing that is pretty interesting that Thucydides tends to chronicle at key moments is there's an eclipse of the sun and the moon during this time. And so, not to be too mystical about it, but these events are read as good and bad omens throughout the war, and so we'll see how people respond to certain natural disasters. We've already seen an earthquake that prevented the first Spartan invasion into Attica back in the First Peloponnesian War. We'll continue to see. So this is taken as a bad omen, and this is the beginning of the war, and it's in a way, foreshadow of the devastation of the war if you read into things like that. There's a man named Nymphodorus during this time that brings an alliance between the Athenians and Perdiccas, the king of Macedonia. So you'll remember previously the Athenians were actually allies with Philip, who was attempting to usurp his brother's throne and become the king of Macedonia, but Athens sees a potential benefit, and so they flop their alliance and ally themselves with Perdiccas, and also Sitalces, the king of Thrace, under the promise of forces, and the Athenians would cease the war in the area against Perdiccas and give back a city of, it's either Therm or Thermi, but that's the name of the city. And again, at the same time, during this counter, the Athenians take Stolium, which is a Corinthian town, and they take Cephalonia. The Athenians invade Megara under Pericles with the largest Athenian force ever assembled up to this time. And they send this land force into Megara, and they send a raiding navy. They plunder most of the land, and they leave. And so it's not, I guess they're not really trying to conquer the land. They take the resources to help the city, and they fall back after they achieve this goal, and they end up doing this annually, and they are able to capture Nicaea, and they use that as a garrison for the Megarian region. The Corinthians set out to recapture some of the lost territory with very limited success. They actually only restore one territory that the Athenians are able to take in this counterattack. So, up to this point, and Pericles kind of puts an exclamation point on this. Sparta is unsuccessful in quickly bringing an end to this war. The Athenians have devastated the Peloponnese behind them. And so things seem to be going well for the Athenians. Generally speaking, of course, they're upset about losing their land in Attica, but they have withstood the first invasion at least. And so there's a funeral ceremony in Athens where Thucydides lists the dead Athenians all over the world, which creates a great sense of pride and glory for the Athenian people. Pericles has a large speech, which is very famous during this time, and he promotes their plan to reassure the people that his plan is indeed working, and that Athens is the ideal Greek polis, and their democracy serves as an education to the Greeks. He's quoted in saying, and they are powerful, first in courage. They don't lean on others like Sparta, but are their own. And you can see that as a little bit of propaganda. Essentially what he's saying is the Peloponnesian League is truly a league where politically they all seem to be fairly on similar footing. Sparta leans on city-states like Corinth to supply the bulk of the navy for the Peloponnese, where Athens, they do have allies. The Plataeans they lean on the Corsians for their navy, but the Athenians' navy in their own right is the most powerful, and they are an empire, and so everyone looks to Athens. There's not really equal footing, politically speaking. It's different than what the league, the Peloponnesian League, is like, and so I think that's what he means. So things are going well, but as we'll see, there's a lot of catastrophes that happen suddenly, and one of the largest happens during this time, and it is the plague that hits Athens from grain trade. Thucydides talks about where they believe that this disease started. It's believed to have started in Ethiopia, and again it spreads to Athens from their ports. And due to the compressed conditions in the city of the population tripling, it spreads like wildfire. So the symptoms are a high fever, inflamed eyes, bleeding tongue and throat. Their breath is of unnaturally foul smell. They experience sneezing and a hoarse voice, a violent cough, violent vomiting of bile, empty retching with spasms. Skin is not hot to the touch, but it is red, and they feel it's like an internal fever. They break out with boils, and their skin is so sensitive that they cannot bear to put clothes on themselves. There's an insatiable thirst. There's an inability to sleep. They suffer from diarrhea and the loss of their extremities. The prognosis is usually dead after 6 to 8 days, and it is also common to die of another sickness due to the weakness after this disease. Many die under either constant care or just they die alone. It didn't really matter. Many medical professionals are killed because of this, despite their commitment and their acts of bravery to not abandon their friends, that they are killed nonetheless. Even the birds would not eat the flesh because those that did died, and there were many pyres lit in mass graves. Thucydides goes and talks about how people respond to this tragedy, which I think it's moments like these where Thucydides really shows his brilliance, but he talks about how people live lawlessly in this. He talks about how they just try to seek pleasure of all kinds before they've, I guess, received their imminent doom, or at least that is the perception. And so it causes a lot of people, the majority of people, to do what they want. And so there are a lot of orgies. There's a lot of sleeping around. There's a lot of drunkenness and debauchery. And instead of what I guess what you would hope to happen would be people bonding together, there being a great sense of compassion. But this is not what happens. People act the way they want to, and, today we party, for tomorrow we die, kind of thing. In a way, it's understandable. It's difficult to know how anyone would react. So, and Thucydides suffered himself from the plague, and the way it traveled through the city is, it hit the underlying parts of the city first. It really devastated the people who lived in the port of Piraeus. It slowly carried up through the city proper, and the way they would design the city, that the poor people are on the outskirts, and as you get closer to the city center, that's where the wealthier people and the more politically powerful people are. So Pericles is more protected than the average Athenian citizen would be, certainly, and the disease slowly spreads up to the city center. Again, Thucydides himself suffered from this, but he was able to survive, and he talks about how the people who did end up surviving felt like they were invincible, and they were able to, or I guess they just lived more bravely, and so it's a very devastating, very, very devastating plague that hits Athens, and it's estimated that about 100,000 people are listed as casualties due to this. So while the plague hit, Sparta sent another invasion to ravage the land, but the Athenians, surprisingly, well, not surprisingly, but it is surprising that they were able to do what they did, but they were able to send another 100 ships to the Peloponnesian eastern coast with mostly successful adventures. And again, it's kind of a mirror of what they did earlier. And after the success and some raids, they are able to come back, but it's not as successful because, again, no one was safe from this plague. This killed a lot of soldiers and important leaders, and a lot of people blamed Pericles for this, and there's this, again, the resentment sort of started from people having to leave their homes, but certainly with this, and this is Pericles' plan, and he reassured them multiple times on this, and here it is that because of his plan, certain things happen that are beyond our control, and certain ill-fated consequences come about by our decisions, and many blame Pericles for this. And it's sort of understandable, but they're kind of only in this position of wealth and power because of Pericles in the first place. So he seeks to encourage them to stay the course and reminds them of his success. And he encourages them that they are brave and they are able to overcome temporary burdens such as the plague. So one thing that Thucydides notes is that the resentment of Pericles is so great that there are actually many people who send messengers to Sparta to discuss terms before Pericles calls the assembly and has his speech. But after this encouragement, Pericles has incredible rhetoric, and he's able to persuade people, and he is able to convince the assembly, and he's reinstated as general after he has to pay a fine, and people cease to send messengers to Sparta. So it's a bittersweet moment because Pericles ends up dying 2.5 years into the war, and he leaves Athens in a lesser state, which is really tough. And Thucydides praises him for his ability to be incorruptible. He wasn't led by the people, he led the people instead. The golden age of Athens was under Pericles, and Thucydides foreshadows the events, because again, he started writing this in the outbreak of the war, or at least started researching and taking notes, and he lives through the entire war, so he foreshadows the ultimate end of the war, which is Athens' defeat, and he talks about how he believes this happened because people didn't follow Pericles' in his likeness, and they were not as wise, they weren't as patient, they were more, I guess, they were more vengeful, and they would act, I guess, more on instinct instead of their reason, and this leads to a lot of sorrow and bitterness due to their impulsiveness. However, during this time as well, in terms of military, Nicias, who is an Athenian general, and 2 others sail for Pontidia to retake it. This design fails in part because the plague found them there as well, so they were traveling, and of course, someone's infected, and they're hit with death there as well. So the siege fails in Pontidia, and they retire back to Athens, but they leave a force there to maintain the siege. So where we left in the first book was that the Athenians actually have a victory in this region, but I guess due to the plague, and again, I'm just speculating, I need to look back at it, but you can imagine where Athenian influence is questioned, and I guess the Athenian power is questioned due to this great plague, and so they had to take back a place like Pontidia, Pontidia. And so, again, and this is in the Thracian region, so what Thucydides does is he tries to paint the different theaters that are going on. So there's a theater of the Peloponnese, there's the theater of the Thracian region, and then he's about to talk about another one, which is the Gulf of Ambracia. And he talks about the Peloponnesian fleet, which contains Spartan vessels, Corinthians, and so the Spartans set sail against the island of Zacynthus, who is an Athenian ally. Though they caused a lot of harm on the land, the people refused to come to terms with the Spartans, and so the Spartans left. And so you see this a lot. It's people haven't quite mastered the way to properly besiege town, and certainly it's expensive to keep up a siege. And so the Spartans leave, and we see this again on the Athenian side as well. When they fail to take up a city, they just end up leaving. The Spartans seek aid from the Persians during this time, and they try to convince the Thracian king Sitalkes, who at the Athens just got into an alliance with, to betray the Athenians and to allow the Spartans to cross the Hellespont to join them to go to the Hellespont and ask them to join against the Athenians in Pontidia during that Athenian siege of Pontidia. Athens responds quickly to this, and they send envoys to the king to capture the Peloponnesian heralds, and they take them back to Athens, where they are killed. The same way the Spartans would kill sailors without question during this time. And we'll see this again later, but the Persians have a great influence in Ionia, and they have a great empire, of course, and the Greeks know that well, and so the Spartans now are turning to face them and to face the Athenians with them and use the Persian hatred of the Athenians to their benefit. This will come back later, but if this initial attempt has failed because of Athenian action. And Sitalkes is still an ally to the Athenians, though had the Athenians not been as quick to respond, perhaps he would have flipped. Again, that's just speculation. So that is, again, in the Thracian region up north towards the Hellespont, so the Spartans can get over into Persian territory, but they fail at this. And then again, we go to the Gulf of Ambracia, or Ambracia. The Ambricots, and many barbarians attack the city called Argos in this region, which is different from the famous Argos that Agamemnon's from, which is in the Peloponnese. But they do this due to years of colonization, because Argos, the city, is Greek, and it is a colony of the Argives, and they have enforced slavery of these people. And so the Ambricots and the barbarians attack this in response to that. They take much of the land, but they fail to take the city. Again, we see this, and they end up dispersing. And so this region is on the western coast of the mainland of Greece, and becomes an important point of contention. And it's more north. It's north of Boeotia. It's actually getting pretty close to the island of Corsia, or the island that contains Corsia is, just to give that some context. And then there's a series of Athenian naval expeditions. Athens sends ships to leave a garrison in Naupactus to prevent Corinthian passage. And if we're looking at a map, Naupactus is on the coast that's just north of the Peloponnese. So, and again, that's where the Athenians gave the Helots an important position, and it allows them to keep an eye on all that Corinth is doing in terms of their navy. So it's a very strategic location for the Athenians to have power in. Athens also sends ships to Lycia for revenue, but they are defeated in battle on land. And so with the invasions not subduing Athens and running low on resources. Let me back up for a second. So Lycia is asked for revenue. They're supposed to be an ally, but they deny this, and so the Athenians send for this, but they're defeated. And then if we look back to the Thracewood region, with the invasions not subduing Athens, the Spartan invasions, that is, and with Pontidia running very low on resources, they actually resort to cannibalism. And Pontidia finally surrenders to the Athenians under a truce of being able to evacuate the city peacefully. So Athens is able to recapture the city after a tough siege, and with a lot of tragedy. I mean, to be able to resort to cannibalism, the amount of starvation that had taken Pontidia is quite remarkable. But again, it is a strategic location because it is right at the isthmus in one of the fingers of the Thracewood region that guards an important region in that. An important peninsula. Sorry, that's the word I was looking for. And so the Athenians are actually upset with this, or at least the way they won Pontidia. They wanted it as an unconditional capture, and they send colonists to resettle the city. So they were upset that the generals in the region allowed for this peaceful evacuation of the Pontidians. So some kind of hit or misses for the Athenians, but mostly they're successful. So now the Spartans invade, but they go towards Plataea. So Archidamnus does not attempt to attack Athens again, but instead focuses on Plataea, which again is a strategic buffer between Athens and Boeotia. Archidamnus comes with peaceful terms of surrender and agreed for a peaceful truce for a few days. And during this time, the Plataeans have their wives and children go to Athens, and after encouragement from an Athenian envoy, they resolve not to betray the Athenians, so they hold out. So again, this is Archidamus being a little cautious, and it costs them again because they're able to get their women and children out, which can be used as leverage in a siege. Though that's cruel, that's how it can go. And so again, Archidamus is criticized for his caution. And so what Archidamus does is he builds a wall around the city to enclose it, and he begins building a ramp out of wood, stone, and rubble to be able to go over their walls and send his forces down into the city. The Plataeans respond to build up their own walls of wood, stone, and hide, animal hide, to compete with this rising ramp. And so they're all trying to build further and further up. They also dig a hole in their wall to start to remove the earth that's supporting the Spartan ramp. And so, they go through this wall, they take out some of the supports beneath the ramp, and so it becomes structurally compromised. But the Spartans find this out, and they're able to plug up the hole with clay to prevent the Plataeans from doing this. Why didn't the Spartans go back into that hole? Well, you'd imagine if they tried to go in, the Plataeans on the other side are going to be able to cave them in or something, so they don't see this as an opportunity to get into the city. Rather, they just want to prevent the Plataeans from coming out. The Plataeans then build a crescent-shaped wall behind their main one to slow the Spartan siege works if they are indeed successful. And then they actually use some engineering, and they are able to lasso and destroy their siege engines. So they were able to rope them down and pull them to destroy them. And they, at the same time, have these large wooden beams, and they tie chains to them, so they're able to lift them up. And they're kind of able to aim them a little bit to where they can release these large beams to fall and crush the nose of the Spartan battering ram. So you can see a lot of this. This is one of the few instances where Thucydides goes into this kind of detail in a siege, like we've seen so far. He really talks about it vaguely for the most part, in terms of they tried to hold out, or they tried to siege the town and then they left. But here he's actually going into a lot of the cool details of what a siege must have looked like in this time. And again, he spends the time because this is such a strategic location for the Athenians. Okay, so what the Peloponnesians end up trying to do, since they've so far failed with their battering ram and their ramp, is they gather a bunch of brushwood and they place it between their ramp and the Plataean wall, and they light it aflame, hoping to burn out the height of the Plataean wall and compromise the wall itself, so they were able to go in. And so the fire was enormous. Thucydides talks about how it was like the largest fire of the war in this context, and it made part of the city inaccessible. But there's actually a rainstorm, and it was able to put out this large fire, and so again the Spartans set to walling in the whole city, and then they released the bulk of their troops, and so this is an initial victory for the Plataeans. And so Thucydides talks about the defenders. There's not many of them. There are 400 Plataeans. And there are 80 Athenians, and then there are 110 women who Thucydides says are there for cooking and keeping the army alive, with being able to provide food for them, and the rest have fled to Athens. So that's Plataea, and we'll return back to it later. Then Thucydides talks about another Athenian expedition to the Thrace-ward Caladician region and Boeotia. So, although Pontida surrendered, other cities remained hostile to the Athenians. Xenophon and two other Athenian generals move in with a force of 2,000 hoplites and 200 cavalry. They attacked Spartolus and Bocce. Bottici. Sorry, that sounds Italian. Anyway, they attack this area in front of the city, and so the Athenians were able to repel the attack. However, the cavalry and light troops were defeated by the opposition. So the Athenians go to attack this region, but the opposing forces come out, though this attack is repelled by the Athenian hoplites. They do end up losing their cavalry and light troops. And then more reinforcements arrive from Olynthus during the battle, which we've mentioned before. But again, if you're looking at a map, it is on the... Sorry, I believe it is... Let me get the map open. Let's see. Olynthus is actually to the north of of Pontida, and so more reinforcements come from that region. And seeing this, the Spartans take courage, and they force the Athenians to fall back. So the Athenians force them back on ensuing counters, but the Chalcidian cavalry is able to keep at a distance with a constant barrage of missiles, so javelins and arrows, and so this forces the Athenian army back into Pontida, and they call for a truce. So they have Pontida, but everyone around them is still very hostile towards them, and they are not able to take over the region, and they have to fall back, in summary. So, again, that's the Thrace theater. Now we're going to go back to the Arcania region, and there are naval conflicts that happen there as well. So the Ambriots and the other barbarians send emissaries to Sparta to help remove from the region the Athenian alliance. They said holding this area would help prevent Athens from sailing round to raid the Peloponnese. So again, it's an important area because it's north of Peloponnese, but it's on the western side. And again, the Athenians sail around, and they use Naupactus as an important staging point. And so they're saying that if you have this area, you can help repel these unopposed raids on the Peloponnese. The Spartans and their allies agreed to this, and they send out a navy with Corinthian and Scionian, which is a city on the Peloponnese, pretty close to Corinth. Those are the two main cities that provide this navy. Cinemus, the Peloponnesian infantry commander, crosses over the Gulf undetected to join with neighboring forces. Perdiccas of Macedon was to send troops, but they came too late. So Perdiccas is now trying to go behind the Athenians and actually aid the Peloponnesians. Perhaps this is due to some of the Athenian failure in the Thraceid region, which is immediately adjacent to Macedon. But I guess it remains a little unclear. So he tries to send troops, but again, they're too late to engage. So without waiting for the Corinthian navy, they attack Laminia and prepare for the attack of Stratus, which is the largest city in the region. And again, this region is, generally speaking, or at least Stratus and others are allied with the Athenians. And And so when the Arcanians learned that, when they learned of this, they looked after the cities separately and asked for Athenians to help. So the Arcanians are, again, generally speaking, allies to the Athenians, but the Ambriots and other barbarians are whom they've been at war with. And so they ask for the Athenians to help. And then Phormio stated non-pactus to guard against the Athenian navy. He is the Athenian naval commander. And so the Peloponnesians and their barbarian allies set into 3 different divisions to attack Stratus. And so again, what the Arcanian strategy is it's kind of every man for himself. Call back to your own individual city. We're not going to try to go out and, if they're going to win this region, they're going to have to do it not in one decisive battle, but they're going to have to take each city, which slows the Peloponnesian ability to capitulate the region. And so again, when they go to Stratus, they separate the Peloponnesian army with, again, their barbarian allies into 3 different divisions. And they set ambushes on the Stratians, and they are able to isolate them. And let's see. Okay, so again, there's the Ambriots, and then there's another. So there's the Ambriots, there's the Peloponnesians, and then there's the Chinoans, who's a barbarian tribe, and they are able to attack Stratus, and they have they have a very large force, and the Chinoans actually refused to make camp, and they went straight for the city out of arrogance because they're great fighters, and they believe that they can take the city on their own. But the Peloponnesians don't know this because, again, because they're separated, there's only so much that they can know what's going on in the other ones, because they're fairly spread out as to surround the region. But seeing this division, the Stratians set up ambushes, which actually send the barbarians into panic. And the Stratians keep a distance and use their slings to push their forces, the barbarian forces, back over the river, where they found refuge in a neighboring city. So back to the Corinthian fleet. So that's the battle that's happening on land. And then the Corinthian fleet at the same time was engaged in a battle with the Athenians. Though the Athenians were outnumbered, 47 Peloponnesian ships to 20, they were able to keep pace north of the Corinthians. So again, the Corinthians are coming to send support for this land invasion, and the Athenians are able to ride up north of the coast to have to force the Corinthians to engage with them, and to also serve as a buffer between the Corinthians and their intended goal. However, the Corinthians tried to escape under the cover of darkness, but they failed to do so. The Athenians were on them, and they were forced into a circular formation, and in which the Athenians hit with rapid hit-and-run attacks, and they were able to eventually spearhead them and created havoc while capturing 20 enemy vessels. So essentially, when the Corinthians try to leave, the Athenians are able to keep up with them again during the night. And so for the defense, the Corinthians, instead of havocly attacking them headlong, they form a circular formation, and the Athenians go up to the circle. They're able to cause some havoc, and they're able to pull back out. And again, they have the lesser number of ships, but if you're able to pop the bubble, so to say, they can disperse by getting into the center of their forces and cause havoc if they were just able to attack one point. So it's a again, it's a Athenian victory, and they're able to cause the havoc by spearheading one point, and they're able to capture 20 enemy ships and disperse the other ones. So after this, the Spartans send more commanders, including Brasidas, for a better battle. The Spartans are upset with their commanders, and so Brasidas, again, who's the one who repelled the Athenian attack of Methone, is given command for this theater. The Athenians likewise send 20 more ships under Nicias, but first he was ordered to aid a gentleman named Polychina against Cydonia and Crete to annex the region into the empire, and this detained him for a while, allowing the Peloponnesians to land a new army and support. So it's kind of interesting. Maybe it's arrogance, but the Athenians felt that they could go all the way down to Crete, help this guy out, and to put that region into the empire, which would actually be a really strategic location for them, as it's southeast of the Peloponnese, and that is another launching point for them. And it's, of course, it's a very, very large island, and if they're able to take even just part of it, that's an important move for them. So maybe they saw that as, they can't continue to send tons of ships everywhere. They're engaged in multiple theaters already, and just to keep their empire contained or under wraps, but they send him first all the way down to Crete, and then he's able to go around. But of course, that takes a long time, and I guess they felt that it was worth that, or perhaps they were a little arrogant that they could do what they want after that great victory. But that's not the case, and the Spartans are able to send a new army for support. And so the Athenians and the Peloponnesians anchor across the Gulf at Rhium for a week, one hoping to avoid the open seas, which is the Peloponnesians, and the others hoping to avoid the narrows, which are the Athenians. So the Athenians are really great in an open conflict in the open sea, and they want to avoid fighting in a confined space, which they felt would give the advantage to the Peloponnesian fleet. And so Rhium is in Ambria, or Ambracia, this region we've been looking at. They are able to stay in this city, Rhium, and kind of wait each other out in the Gulf. And so what ends up happening is the Peloponnesians, to draw the Athenians out, sailed for Naupactus. And so the Athenians were forced then to leave, which, they had to sail along the coast to prevent the attack. But then also at the same time, there's the Spartan army who's able to keep pace with the Athenians on land. So the Athenians are kind of getting sandwiched, at least their navy is. They got Spartan arms following them around the coast, so they can't just land. So essentially what would happen is, if they were defeated in a naval conflict, you tend to try to go back land. That way you can at least save your men. Well, if they land, they got a Spartan army on the coast. We're just waiting for them, which is following them down the coast. So, yeah, and then, you got that other navy that's going to try to capture your most strategic location in this region, Naupactus. And so under pursuit, the Athenians are able to actually use a merchant vessel to strategically go around that and ram the lead ship. So, again, they don't have that. This is still the same 20 ships that the Athenians had in the first naval conflict, and because, again, Nicias is in Crete at this time. And so the Athenians outnumber them, and the Athenians form a single column, and the Peloponnesians are able to cut off and destroy 9 of the 20 ships, and under pursuit. All but one of the remaining ships made it to defend Naupactus. So you can just kind of see this large Peloponnesian fleet that's slowly eating away at the Athenian navy. But again, all but one of 12 remaining, so 11 make it to defend Naupactus. And then under this pursuit, this is when the Athenians are able to round this merchant vessel. So I can't imagine being the merchant who is seeing this unfolding, just going about your day. And I mean, it really, without him being there, you don't know what would have happened, because essentially what he's able to do is the Athenians are able to use the Peloponnesian pursuit, which has at this point kind of spread itself thin, and the lead vessel is right up on them. And we see this a lot. It seems like the less experienced navies tend to spread themselves too thin. They don't use their numbers to advantage, which allows the Athenians to do something like this, where they sail around this merchant vessel, making it a buffer, and they're able to sail around and then ram right in to the lead ship and surprise and disorder the Peloponnesian ships. And some run aground. Again, they're close to the coast as well, and the Athenians capture and kill other ships. And the Spartan commander actually commits suicide when he saw the pursuit is lost. This is not Brasidas, it's another commander. And so after the battle, the Peloponnesians withdrew to Corinth. Soon Nicias from Crete arrives to support the Athenians. So the best shot that the Peloponnesians had to defeat the Athenian navy doesn't succeed, even though they had the upper hand. And now the Athenians are reinforced, so it just looks pretty bad for the Peloponnesians at this time. And so before winter broke out, the fleet dispersed. Brasidas and others decided to attack the unguarded port of Piraeus from the Megarian dockyard at Nicaea. And so they arrive from Corinth at night. So this is, again, right before winter breaks out. And usually during winter, this armies kind of hunker down. And Brasidas, he's very aggressive. We'll see this later, especially, but he sees that the port is not guarded. And he's like, let's attack that. Since we've been defeated, let's beat them at home now that the Athenians are too stretched the other direction. And we're between them and their precious port. So they arrive from Corinth again to Nicaea, and then they sail to Salamis instead of Athens port due to unfavorable winds, and ravage the land. And Salamis is an island just across the bay from the port of Piraeus. And the Athenians will be very thankful for this unfavorable wind, because instead of being able to go attack the Athenians, this gives the Athenians enough time. And so this launched a series of beacons to warn the Athenians from Salamis. And so they're like, oh my gosh, we're about to be attacked. And they quickly come to support the unguarded port, which could have easily been taken if the Peloponnesians actually pushed the attack to the port instead of focusing on Salamis so much. And the Athenians quickly released their boats for the island, and this forced the Peloponnesians back, but not without their capture of a fort and plundering of Salamis. So it's not what Brasidas wanted. They do have some success, certainly, on the island of Salamis, but the Athenians are saved, and their port is protected. And so the Athenians then set up a blockade to guard the entrance of the harbors and learn their lesson. And then we go up to Macedon, and so Sitalkes, who is, again, the son of Thrace, who is a ally to the Athenians, campaigned against Perdiccas, the son of the king of Macedon. And this is the same Perdiccas that we've seen earlier. And originally, there was a three-way alliance between the Athenians, the Macedonians, and the Thracians. But this comes to an end, and Sitalkes attacks. At the beginning of the war, Perdiccas promised not to claim his brother Philip's claim to the throne, but did not give this up. So I must have misspoke earlier, saying that that Philip was the usurper. Again, Philip was supported by the Athenians. Then the Athenians saw the advantage in Perdiccas, and they went with him. But Sitalkes must be in league with Philip, and they support him. But since Perdiccas did not give up his claim, breaking his promise to Sitalkes and doing so, this causes a conflict with Sitalkes and Perdiccas. So Sitalkes, again, is allied with the Athenians, and he wants to, is allied with the Athenians to end Perdiccas in a war in the Thrace region again. He called all support across the Odrysian Empire, which is this Thracewood region, and it goes all the way past the Hellespont. That's why the Spartans had to talk to this guy to get across the Hellespont to get to the Persian Empire. And so he's in league with the Athenians, and after acquiring his forces all across this region, he set into Macedon from a city called Doberus to install Philip as king. The Lower Macedonians were unable to resist, and Sitalkes was able to capture many settlements, but they were unable to take some, and so but not being discouraged by this, they continued into the mainland. The Macedonians would not engage in infantry, but again used the classic tactic of charged cavalry when they could. The massive force ravaged the land of Macedon, and the Chalcidians, and the Chalcidians is again the name of the region in this Thracewood area, and they are able, Sitalkes' force is able to ravage this land as well with the Macedonian land. And then he pressed south. Many Greek states were actually afraid that this would be used against them and against the allies. Many Greek states were afraid that this would be used against them. And since Athens is an ally, they were supposed to send military support. They send resources and envoys, but the fleet did not send military support. However, Sitalkes does not move into Greece, but left after Sitalkes' nephew made a secret deal with Perdiccas to marry his daughter, the princess of Macedon. And so I guess Sitalkes see this now as playing to his advantage. Perdiccas continues to go his way and becomes king, and since his nephew's making under the table deals with Perdiccas with the promise of his daughter, Sitalkes' lineage would have a very powerful claim to the throne only if Perdiccas is legitimized. And so he calls off his forces, and with supplies running low and winter coming, they send back to Thrace. So there's kind of this invincible force that's coming in. The Greeks are afraid because it's getting close to them, but he does not go further enough south to attack the mainland of Greece, and then with that alliance set, he goes back. So that was the Macedonian conflict. Now we go back to Arconia, and so in that region, with the onset of winter, the Peloponnesians disband their navy. After their defeat with the Athenians and their attack on Salamis, and their failed attempt to take the port of Piraeus, they dispersed their navy with the onset of winter. The Athenians repacked their leaders, thought unreliable in the region, Stratus, and they installed new ones. So there, for whatever reason, there was some skepticism about the leaders that were there currently, and so the Athenians used this time to send more loyal subjects up there to look after the conflict there. All was under their alliance, but Onidai, which was actually the region that the barbarians fled across the river to when they failed to take Stratus, and that is the Peloponnesian allied city. So, but everywhere else in the region is under Athenian influence, which, due to its protection from a river and a marshy land, they decided not to take during winter. The Athenians, that is, decided not to try to take this city due to its natural conditions. Thus, the Athenians went to Naupactus and returned to Athens. So there's a lot of conflict going on in this region, but the Spartan and Peloponnesian armies are unable to take it back, or to take it over, and they're defeated by the Athenians. So this is the end of Book 2. These are kind of the main theaters, and a lot happens in a short period of time, but though Sparta has had some success, the general feeling now is the Athenians are powerful. They're invincible in naval conflict. Even when they have way less boats, they're able to still find a way to win due to tactical maneuvering. And so, just to help summarize certain things and some certain key moments, to look at some quotes from Thucydides during this time. One of them is from Pericles. He's quoted in saying, "The true strength of spirit would rightly be attributed to those who have the sharpest perception of both terrors and pressures, and through that knowledge do not shrink from danger." So this is partially how he defends himself in light of the defeat and the tragedy of the plague. And so he's saying that the true test of strength is to be able to look those instances in the eye and to still muster through them and do not shrink away from this danger. And then this is on the tragedy of the plague. Thucydides talks about pious or impious. It made no difference in their view when they could see all dying without distinction. So that goes to how people decided to respond. It wasn't, often people will think, why has this happened to me? Why did God or the gods put this upon me? Have I not been pious enough? But upon seeing the fact that it hit the righteous and the unrighteous all come to the same end, as and this supports what Solomon says over and over in Ecclesiastes, all come to die, all is vanity, and they see this, and their response is again to act out in a life that seeks only pleasure. And then another quote that talks about how people are starting to get resentful towards Pericles is Thucydides says that men accommodate their memories to their current experience. So they see how things aren't going well, and their resentment builds up. And the way they see Pericles is that they don't remember the greatness that happened. They remember, it's like a selective memory, and they're able to tweak their thoughts towards the removal of Pericles and towards ill intent, which I thought was very powerful. It's in keeping with the idea that memory is not the greatest source of truth, perhaps, and people are able to twist and manipulate it and almost control it to achieve a certain narrative of their own making. And then this is when Pericles not Pericles, but Thucydides is foreshadowing the fall, the reasons of the eventual fall of Athens. And he talks about the leaders after Pericles pursued policies motivated by private ambition and private gain to the detriment of Athens herself and her allies. Any success was more to honor the individual initiator, but failure affected the whole city and harmed the war effort. So it's like the success was to help a few, but the defeats, which is the catastrophe of the whole empire. And then a great speech that Brasidas gives in preparation for one of the naval conflicts is, he says, fear drives our memory, and skill without courage is useless. So he's trying to motivate and to call his men to courage, and that though you have skill, you need to latch on to courage, because without the courage, your skill is useless. And of course, I ended up losing, but I thought that was an insightful quote. So this is book 2, and then we'll continue on with book 3.